So today I want to be covering attacking themes. This kind of a bit of a follow-on to last week when I talked about pawn structures and what your plans would be in those positions. I have a couple of examples, particularly from the Kocan and French pawn structures that I talked about. And also, if you really want to get better at attacking, if you find you have difficulty executing a winning attack, or if you find you're just in your games, you're never the one attacking, I really recommend The Art of Attack in Chess by Vladimir Vukovic. It's a really great book. And not just because of the examples, but the logic he talks about, preconditions for attack and such. Those are important ideas. If you recall, we looked at a video a while ago now when Kasparov was going over his game with Karpov, right, in the World Championship match, and he was showing all these variations, but at the beginning he talked about, I have 6 pieces, he has 4, my attack's going to work, right? Just for reference, he didn't actually calculate all of that stuff in the game. He just kind of intuitively knew the attack would work. So that kind of stuff is really helpful. So I'm going to start off with a nice historical example. So this was played even before the beginning of the 20th century. So this is really old, really towards the beginning of Lasker's career. And to my knowledge, this is the first instance of a at least sound 2-bishop sacrifice. So he started with knight h5. Really logical beginning. He's trying to not only move another attacker next to the king, but eliminate the knight on f6, which is doing a good job defending at the moment. Now, black doesn't want to let white play bishop takes f6, and then queen g4 might get mated, so takes a knight. But now this allows white a very nice continuation to remove all the defenders from the king side. Starting with bishop h7, king takes, queen h5, and now the second bishop gives up its life on g7. And black essentially has to take, and now queen g4 and rook f3. And really common thing when you sacrifice 2 bishops is to checkmate on these 2 files on the king side. Now, luckily here, black can stave off mate by playing e5 and blocking on h6, but nonetheless, white ends up winning a lot of material. He's after rook h3, he wins the queen, and then plays queen d7, forking the black bishops. So black does end up with a rook and minor piece against the queen, but given that white has extra pawns and black still has a weak king and other weaknesses on the queen side, it's not really defensible. And yeah, the rest was not really too difficult. You can look at it in your own time if you want to see how white converts. But anyway, going back to the original position, having these 2 bishops aimed at the king like that can be really dangerous. And you'd be surprised how often the possibility of a double bishop sacrifice comes up. And in fact, just the other day, I had a student who was able to play it in an actual game. And I've been able to do it myself in games. It comes up more than you might think. It's not like you're going to have it every single game, of course, but it can be more common than you might imagine. Okay, and so that game was about eliminating pawn cover of the king. So that's a really common idea. I'm sure you guys at least know of a little bit. But now I want to talk about another theme, which is drawing the king out into the open. So this game goes along that theme. Just for reference, by the way, Aliekin was playing this in a blindfold simul in 1916. Now, I didn't look to confirm. I know Aliekin played a 36 or 37 board simul once. I'm not sure if this was a game from that.
Probably not. I think
Or
that the 36 one was the Paris 1932, I think.
okay, so that was much later. Okay.
The 1929.
So okay, that's good to know. So this is from much more likely a much smaller simul. This was years before. Nonetheless, really impressive to find this attack in a blindfold simul. Just gives you an idea of how strong Aliekin was. In any case, white to play and move has just a devastating attacking idea here.
I would want to play knight g5 and target that e6 pawn.
Yeah, knight g5 is one of the first things that most people are going to think of because attacking e6, not easy to defend, but black has various ways he can defend. Knight f8's one idea, or possibly bishop f8 is better. And it's not easy to actually win e6. By the way, I'll point out one idea is knight c6, and yes, this does win a pawn, but you can do much better. It wins a pawn because after bishop takes, queen e6, king moves, queen c6, right? White has extra pawn, but white's still going to have a lot of work to do to win the game. So it's not knight c6 either. While you guys are thinking, one of the most classical examples of an attack that draws the king out into the open is a famous game between Kotov and I forget who the victim was in Zurich 1953, where black sacrificed the queen for the pawn on h3 that game. If you're not familiar with that game, I definitely recommend you take a look. So if you know anything about that game, that might give you some hints for what white did here. You guys want to keep thinking, or do you want the first move? You want the first move? Okay. So Alyekin played knight f7. So first point is that if black doesn't take the knight, you're going to take knight e6. Well,
and then knight e5.
Well, yeah. So first of all, if you don't take the knight, queen e6, and smothered mates are threatened. So king pretty much has to take. But try to figure out what white can do after that. Yeah.
King takes and knight g5.
Okay, so you think knight g5.
Why not knight e5?
Well, king g8 would lead to mate, I think, because of queen e6 and knight f7, knight h6, queen g8, a smothered mate idea. So after knight g5, king g8 doesn't work because this is mate, right? King f8, queen f7, and this leads to the typical smothered mate, right? Queen g8, doesn't matter which way you take, knight f7, right? But king g8 is not black's only move. What else can black do here? King f8, yes. And if queen takes e6, he can at least stave off mate a little bit with knight e5. And then if white takes, I don't know, for instance, d takes, black can play bishop d5, and then take, then queen takes. And white is definitely winning here after, for instance, knight h7, takes, and queen d5. Right, so that is definitely winning. So the only other thing that black could do here is king to g6, right? So now I think, queen takes e6. Looks like it makes the most sense, right? You guys see any defense here for black? Rook f8. I guess that kind of defends. Well, never mind. I think queen f5 is mating, right?
Yeah, I don't know. It's bishop e4.
Followed by a knight discovery and, a quick mate to follow. For instance, king h6, knight f7 is mate. King h5, knight f7 looks equally winning. G5, queen g5 is mate. King h4, queen h3 is mate. So yes, knight g5 is one way. Alyekin also chose another way that wins, which is queen takes e6.
Tal would be proud.
Yeah. And this has the same ideas. If king f8, knight g5, we have the same position. And if king g6, white also mates here. He started with g4. The idea is just to cover the h5 square, and yeah, stopping mate on f5 next move is not possible for black.
And if king takes queen, it's just
Yeah, there's nothing black can do here to defend f5. Yeah, bishop e4 just bishop takes, knight h4 is mate.
Instead of king g6, can you show king takes e6?
Oh yeah, if king takes e6, knight g5 is the amusing mate in the middle of the board. So yeah, occasionally, instead of removing the king's pawn cover, it's important to draw the king out into the open, right? Now, I'm sure you guys are all really familiar with this idea, right? For instance, you might have seen the fried liver, right? Where you take on f7 to draw the king out towards the center, right? So very similar idea. Okay. Now, let's tie back to yesterday. I talked about the Kocan pawn structure, and this is a game between Kamsky and Sarawan from the 2012 U.S. Championship. And they played this mainline Kocan, and I talked about this kind of pawn structure not yesterday, last week, with pawn on d4 versus pawns on e6 and c6, right? I talked about how White's way to play for an advantage here was to get a kingside attack. So this game is just a great example of how to do that. I mentioned playing g4 is a very important idea against Black's pawn structure. So let's see how White executes that. So first you have to move the knight to clear the way for the g pawn. That's important. And now White begins with g4.
By the way, if
Mm-hmm.
Black would have queen d5 here, and then try to go for a trade with
Oh, in this position?
yeah, and then go try for a trade e4.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Lose all your attack potential.
Yeah, one of Black's big ideas here, and Shandor talks about this, is to try to play moves like queen d5 in these positions. Now, I'll just mention that timing is a little bit important. After queen d3, if you play queen d5 right away, it runs into c4, queen e4, and then queen b3. And defending b7 is actually a little bit awkward. But yes, after castles king b1, queen d5 definitely does make a lot of sense. This would have been an improvement for Black, because now c4, queen e4, and since the king is on b1, White can't avoid a queen exchange. And yes, like you were saying, after that, White's attacking potential, of course, is hugely reduced, right? So yeah, thanks for pointing that out. But anyway, Sarawan played c5, and now g4. White gets a really dangerous attack. I don't know if I would say White's just winning here, but it is very hard to defend. So knight takes g4, queen e2, defending the f2 pawn. Now rook g1. So yeah, sacrificing the g4 pawn is a really common idea in these pawn structures. So if you're White, don't be afraid to do that. Now knight e5. Knight e5, importantly, guards the d7 square. And you'll see why it's important in a minute. Bishop takes c5, and now bishop h6. So White starts removing the pawn cover from the Black king, right? Same idea as from the first game of Lasker, right? So g takes h6, and now rook d7. So this is exactly why it was important to guard the d7 square, because now White wants Black to play knight takes d7 and draw the knight away from the defense of the king. So the point now, Sarawan sacrificed the queen, by the way, but if you play knight takes d7, how is White planning to win? Queen g4? Queen g4, then queen takes e5. For instance, here.
No, knight g4, g6.
Knight g6. See, I'm not sure that helps the attack, though. Black can take it, and
And then queen takes e6.
I don't see a direct follow-up there. No, White has a much easier way here. What's that? On d7? I'm not sure this would be a good idea. I think Black could play queen takes d7. I think Black is okay here. Problem is if
But then he could play.
Yeah,
He could play queen e5 check.
queen e5 just f6 though. And
Yeah, you can take bishop.
yeah.
oh, you're down a rook. Keep in mind,
Your whole idea is to attack.
White's not interested in winning pieces on the queen side here. So think about why White took on h6, right? So think about why white took on h6. Opening the G file was cool, but it also created a new weakness.
Well, here if you can get on the C1 H6 diagonal, you threaten H6,
Yeah.
and that's a mating threat.
Yeah.
Oh, so queen d2.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Queen d2. The threat is queen h6 mate, and black actually can't even defend it.
Anywhere.
Black can play king h7, but now, excuse me, how does white win now? For a moment, it looks like everything might be under control for black, but
Queen D3.
well, queen d3, I think black might play f5, and it's not clear how to win.
Oh, knight g4.
Yep. And interestingly enough, can't defend h6. Queen h6 followed by a knight discovery is just going to be mate. So black is just dead lost here. See, after rook d7, knight takes d7, gets mated by queen d2, so black has to give up the queen now, but after takes and queen d2, this fork on h6 and the knight is again, decisive here. Black held on a little bit, but in any case, he's in a losing position here. So yeah, that g4 advance is a really big idea in this pawn structure. So let's look at another example from this. Now, this was a different version of the Kocan, but the pawn structure nonetheless was pretty much the same. So again, we have this e6, c6 structure. Just by the way, this variation starting with knight d7, it is playable for black, although it's not really fashionable nowadays. It tends to just be a lot riskier for black than the mainline Karo. But Karpov did play it for many years with some decent success, so it's not like white's just winning. Anyway, one of the main points I want to emphasize here is that it's really thematic in this line for white to sacrifice material. So, for instance, queen takes d4 is not good here. White can play knight f3, and for instance, if you play queen d5, now knight e5 is really good. Black just cannot defend the f7 pawn. Now, just to show you a fun variation, black can try queen takes g2, but it doesn't really work out very well. White can play rook f1, and he's kind of in some serious trouble. The threat white has is knight f3, followed by rook g1, trapping the queen. And besides, f7 is under attack. So black doesn't really have a lot of good options here. So in any case, after bishop d3, black play h6, push knight away. So knight goes back. Now knight e5, so the other knight could come out more naturally. And here we see g4 again. Now this time white hasn't even captured the queen side. But on the plus side, black has played h6, weakening his king side. So black really wishes they might not have played h6 now, because even though it pushed the knight back, makes that permanent weakness on the king side. Just pointing out here, whenever you're defending against a kind of wing attack like that, or you're attacking on a wing, it's important to recognize these little pawn moves that make weaknesses. They're known as like hooks that you can use to attack. So, for instance, if the black pawn were on h7, the condition for a successful white attack wouldn't really be there, because white could play g4, g5, but you haven't removed any of the king's cover. So keep that in mind when you're attacking and defending too. Any pawn moves you make near your king are going to make it weaker. So just important to recognize that. So white even plays king f1 here. Now this is unusual that white will kind of leave the king in the same vicinity that he's attacking, but in this case it works out just fine because white has so many pieces around the king. Not easy to attack it. So now white begins the attack with knight h7. Again, the idea is white just wants to remove defenders. So this may seem surprising, but let's figure out the point. So if black played knight takes h7, what do you think white's intention was?
Bishop h6.
Yeah, bishop h7, good start. Removing a defender, right? King takes, only reasonable move. Now what?
Queen h5.
Queen h5 is another good start. King has to go to g8.
And then queen h6.
Queen h6. I'm not sure. I think queen f6 might work.
Knight g6.
Well, takes, and it's, oh, knight takes.
Yeah, the knight guards the queen, yeah.
Knight g6.
Knight g6, black will play f takes. And
Rook
yeah, rook g7. Removing another defender. King takes,
And then bishop h6.
bishop h6, yep. So if the king tries to run to the queen side, queen g5 is mate. And other moves don't work out. If king g8, queen g4, followed by queen g7 is mate. And finally, if you move the king somewhere on the h file, it doesn't work because if bishop takes f8, and then queen f7 is mate after, right? For instance, takes, queen f7, and then, I don't know, maybe knight g6 mate, right? Queen g7 also works, of course. So yeah, another example of just removing defenders from the king. And this is an important idea to remember because a kind of rook sacrifice like that, getting rid of a pawn next to the king, that's even more common than a double bishop sacrifice, actually. So that's a very important idea to remember. So after knight h7, black played queen c7, trying to eliminate knight on e5, but this doesn't work out either. Bishop h6,
Ooh.
knight e8. Looks like black is maybe doing okay now, but bishop g7, and rook takes, right? We've seen this thing. Getting rid of everything on g7. King takes, now queen g4, and now the final touch is nice. Knight f6. And the threat of checking on the h file is just devastating here, right? You know, if bishop e5, then queen h5, queen g5, and white mates on h6. And if knight takes f6, then white has queen h4, king g7, queen g5, queen f6, queen g5, and then finally queen h7 mate. So yeah, I thought this was a really, really pretty attacking game. Shows a lot of white's ideas. So again, in this pawn structure, playing g4, g5, really important idea. Also keep in mind, it's probably only going to be good if black has already weakened his king side with something like h6, which in the Kocan, fortunately, is pretty common, right? In the classical main line, black plays h6 for the light squared bishop on f5, so it doesn't get trapped. And in this line, it's to kick knight off of g5. So luckily, in this kind of pawn structure, it's very common. And like I mentioned last time, too, the French Rubinstein, it's commonly results in this kind of pawn structure as well. So this was a game between Ivan Chuck and McGraw, and whoops, someone's trying to play me here. All right. And here white played a really classical Sicilian idea. So if you're black and played Sicilian, you really need to be aware of this idea. And if you're white, also really need to be aware. So white played knight d5. Whoops. So this is a really, really common idea in all kinds of different Sicilians. There's a couple points. One is to open up files for the rooks. In this case, the e file. Another important point is to get another good square for the knight, right? In this case, black's pawn on e6 has to take the knight, so knight on b3 can be moved to f5.
Yeah.
So you can really improve your pieces this way. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when you play this kind of sacrifice, you're almost never going to be able to calculate like a forced mate or something. That's just not possible. So typically, you're playing this just with the idea of making your opponent have a difficult position to defend. So in this case, white has no forced clear win, but it's just very hard to defend black's position. So e takes. Now, by the way, black is not necessarily forced to take the knight, but if you don't, you're just going to lose a pawn on b4. So that is not going to be any fun. So e takes, takes. Now knight a7. Um, now I guess black could have considered knight e5, but then white has the f5 square without even being out of piece. So this wouldn't have been good either. So he played knight a7. This move may look awkward, but it was actually his best chance because black wants to put knight on c8 to defend the bishop on e7. So this was actually probably a wise choice. Now the knight moves towards f5 square to attack the bishop on e7. Black gets rid of the d5 pawn. Now knight f5. So now, unfortunately for black, he can't play bishop e6 to block the e-file. It's really natural to want to do that, but here it doesn't work. How does white take advantage here? No, if bishop c4, I think black could play either bishop takes f5 or queen takes c4.
Knight g7.
Yeah, knight g7 is tempting, but after something like king f8, it's maybe not entirely clear.
Might win a pawn, but yeah.
No, knight takes e7.
Yeah, knight e7, and the point is to pin on the e-file. So whether king or queen takes f5 is going to win the bishop.
Yeah.
So white regains the piece, and the black king is still stuck in a very dangerous spot in the center. So black played knight c6 to defend the bishop on e7. Now bishop e4. So unfortunately, black is going to lose that light squared bishop, which was the only piece that could block the e-file. And it's unfortunate because otherwise white takes on c6. So if black, for instance, played bishop e6, the same theme as before. Takes on c6, takes on e7, and then f5, and white wins the piece back. So black had to take on e4, but now it's really hard to get any activity and break out of this. Cause
Can you ever consider castling here to just get your king off the e-file?
who,
Or is
black?
that just suicide? Yeah.
Um,
I was thinking queenside, but
yeah, castles looks awfully dangerous. I'm sure there's many ways to win for white.
and knight h6. But,
Probably queen e2 might be the simplest. And it's not easy to see how you stop queen g4, right? And if you play king h5, queen h5,
yeah.
makes
But
anyway.
queenside was no safer.
Oh, castling queenside?
Yeah.
Let's see.
I mean, long term, this is bad, but
Yeah, let's see. I'm thinking. I'm
double
thinking.
the rooks, force the bishop to f8.
Take on the e7.
Well,
Take the pawn.
possibly. I'm thinking rook c4 might actually be the best. The threat is rook takes c6 and knight e7, and it's actually not easy to defend against that. For instance, if you play king b7, queen d5 with all kinds of threats, and king b8 doesn't look any better, I think queen d5 still looks good here, because if rook c8, knight d4, and I don't see how you save the knight. So yeah, I think rook c4 is a problem
Right.
if castle queenside. So yeah, that's why he played king f8, I presume. But yeah, this doesn't work out well either. Just rook e1, and unfortunately, black can't play bishop d8 because then rook e8's checkmate. So he has to play rook e8, and it's really sad because now that's like a forever pin. You're not really ever getting out of that. So black is just tied in knots. Now it's still not easy to win with white because all your pieces are almost ideally placed. So you still have to figure out a way to improve your position. But luckily, it is possible for white. It starts with queen e2, and then queen g4. Of course, he wasn't trying to win the pawn on the queen side. I guess he could have taken on a6, but it wasn't necessary. And now rook e2 and g3. So what white wants to do is double up on the g file. That's why he's trying to open it up. Play rook g2, rook takes g3. Really getting dangerous. So knight d4, black gives back some material, knight e7. So now material is even, and black's king is still wide out in the open, and white wins pretty quickly here. And then finally wins the queen here.
Yeah.
So, So yeah, this was a perfect example of a knight b5 sacrifice. Uh, if you want to find even more examples, Tall actually did this sacrifice a lot. He played the white side of Sicilians a lot, of course, but if you just Google like Mikhail Tal knight z5, you'll be able to find some fun games there. Uh, so so yeah, this is really typical theme in the Sicilian. Really important if you play a knight or for any kind of Sicilian where you play e6. Now, if you play the dragon, you're not going to face this a whole lot with black, right? Since you almost never play e6 in the dragon. So that is one exception, right? But almost all their Sicilians, Khan, Taimanov, Najdorf, classical, all those, you're have to face this possible idea. Okay. So let's look at a not typical Sicilian line, actually. So this game started off with this funky knight f6 move, and then e5. And to start with, white played this really funky looking knight a4 move. It turns out it's actually pretty ingenious, and we'll see why. So black played knight e7. And now this is a really important attacking theme. This is more tied to the opening and middle game, really. But it's a really important thing for you guys to remember. e6. E6 for white as a pawn sacrifice, or e3 for black is common too. There's a couple of really important ideas here. So one is that it really limits the scope of the bishop on f8. Note that it's not at all easy for black to try to develop this piece. And secondly, it creates a new weakness on e6 and blocks the bishop on c8 from developing too. And of course weakens the h5 e8 diagonal. Does all kinds of good things. And this kind of pawn sacrifice can come up quite often in openings, especially if you're an e4 player. It can come up a lot. So it's a really big idea.
Is it, I would imagine, in Alyekin's defense it appears?
Oh yeah, Alyekin's defense, you will see it in the Kocan commonly as well. Very, very common idea. I guess you almost never would see this in the French defense because black plays e6 so early, right? But yeah, you'll see it in the Kocan. You'll see it in Alyekin's defense. You'll see it in the Perk, by the way.
Would you see it in a Scotch Gambit, in a knight f6 line?
Yeah, in that particular opening, it's unusual because black has pawns on d7 and f7, so it's a little more unusual there. But yeah, after this game, I'll show you some examples from openings where you want to play this kind of move. So, but anyway, let's see how it works out here. So black has to take, because if you don't, white will take on f7, take on c5. Black's king will be weak, and he'll be up a pawn, so he must take. And now b4. Another really, really cool move. So white's trying to undermine the d4 pawn, because if you can get the knight on d4, the e6 pawn is going to be a big weakness. So b4 was really creative. Takes, knight takes. Now knight f6. And it looks like black has everything under control, but not really. Bishop b5. Bishop d7. Now knight takes e6. So the bishop cannot take knight because of the pin on the a4, e8 diagonal. So queen a5. Now c4. Another very nice move. Defending the knight on a4, defending the bishop on b5. Still the knight on e6 is immune. King f7.
And why don't you take the bishop?
Yeah, bishop takes b5.
Bishop takes b5. No, that's certainly possible. White would take on b5, I presume.
And you can't take that?
Well, yeah, you can't take b5 again because of c7, knight c7 check. But yeah, this would have been possible. Now, I presume black did want to do this because it opens up this diagonal, so the queen can come out to b3. So now, for instance, if you played king f7, queen b3 looks very scary, right? So I presume black did not want to open that diagonal. So he played king f7 first, but it turns out this really isn't great either. So knight g5 and knight c5. And it's getting really uncomfortable for black. He played bishop g4. Now again, he didn't take on b5. Now I'm almost certain why, because after c takes, white threatens queen b3 with a quick mate.
Yeah.
Right, so here it's definitely not a good idea. So he played bishop g4. But now white played this pretty bishop e8 move. threatening bishop f7 mate. So of course the queen's immune. Have to play g6, give your king to g7 square. But now queen g4, bishop f7, knight e6, and f4. f4 guarding d5 square. Now note that it was important not to play bishop b2 because then black would bail out with queen e5. And after bishop takes, knight takes, material is even, and white has these awkward pieces, and he's gonna lose some material himself. So f4 was important. Now queen e5 doesn't work, since after f takes, the open f file also gives white avenues to attack. Right, knight e5, castles, and black's not going to be having much fun here.
And why don't wanna go to h6 before that?
What's that?
Why don't you go to h6 before?
Instead of f6?
Yeah.
Oh, king h6? In this case, I presume d4, perhaps. And with the idea of moving the knight and exposing an attack on g5. Yeah, that doesn't look particularly fun either. And black doesn't have a lot of checks. If you play b3, white just plays king e2. But okay, king f6, f4, and now the threat of bishop b2 is just really hard to meet. h6, but and white wins the queen, and yeah, from here, an extra piece, it's not too hard to win. But yeah, that e6 idea was important. So let's look at some actual examples from openings where e6 is a good idea. So let's take a look at Alyakin's defense, how it can happen there. So knight f3, and now a common mistake I've seen, and I've been on the white side of this too, is black players who are not familiar with Alyakin's defense will play knight c6. But this is a mistake. White can play c4, knight b6, and now e6. And it's very difficult for black to defend here. The big point is that bishop takes e6 runs into d5. And if f takes e6, white plays knight c3, followed by bishop d3, knight g5, and the king side is very weak. You know, this possible threat of queen h5 is not at all easy to deal with. And developing this bishop is hard. Now g6 is also met by the, thematic, right, h4. h5 is not at all easy to meet. Just one opening point, by the way. E6 first would be a little bit too soon because it lets the black knight retreat to the king side. Bishop takes is still losing because of c4, but after f takes, c4, black has knight f6 this time. So the knight's really important on the king side since it guards h5. So just one point there in the opening is that you want to play c4 first to force the knight over to the queen side. And only then is e6 a good idea. So e6 is good there, and it can also happen in, for example, the perk. So, for example, d6. Say something like this. So let's say black plays something. I mean, this is obviously bad for a number of reasons, but e5 and followed by e6 is just very strong. Yeah, in the perk it might be more obvious in other positions. Now another example is in the Kocan. So for instance, c6. Now of course in the Kocan to play e6 you need your e-pawn. So e5, right? Now bishop f5, and for instance here, g4 is an idea. And a lot of times you'll see black play bishop d7, and it's because they're afraid of bishop g6 and now e6. And in this position, the idea is that if black takes on e6, it's not so much that bishop on c8 is out of the game, like in some cases, and it's not the case that you're trying to that you're going to checkmate black. But the point is here, the bishop on f8 is just a horrific piece, and you have the e5 square under a lot of control. So you can play knight f3 and occupy the e5 square with your pieces, and that bishop on f8 is just going to suffer for a very long time.
After G4.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'll see many players play bishop d7 here.
Don't you play bishop E4? I think Schindler recommends.
Yeah, Shandorf does recommend bishop e4, and the important difference, just for the record, the difference there is that after bishop g6, e6, f3 square is available for the knight. So that's why Shandorf and Carol Kahnbuck recommends bishop e4, because now e6 after f3, bishop g6, e6. E6 is not nearly as strong anymore because the knight cannot occupy e5 so easily. So yeah, this is a far better version. The fact that the knight can't get to e5 makes a big difference.
I've also seen when black plays bishop g6, I've also seen h4 here.
Yeah, h4 is perfectly good too.
Geary's played that a time or two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just pursuing the bishop. One
And then
point
h5
is
is usually the response, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
h5 and even now, for example,
Yeah,
e6 is
right.
good. And White's point here is that he's getting the g5 square, possibly for the knight as well. So yeah, in the Caro-Kann, e6 can be a big idea, almost always in the advanced Caro-Kann because you have to keep your e-pawn. Yeah, advanced Caro-Kann, Aliekin's defense, Perk, playing e6 is a big idea in those openings.
But I guess the perk, or if you're playing, you wouldn't play e6 in the Austrian attack though.
Well, it depends. You would. So for instance, I guess the Austrian attack is the quintessential, place where you play e6. So for example, f4, right, initiates the Austrian, bishop g7, knight f3, and now c5 is the big main move in the Austrian, right? Now it's not the most common move. Castling is the most common move for black, but nowadays castling is not looked upon favorably because of e5, and white gets a very strong kingside attack. For instance, knight d7, h4, and since the knight's abandoned the kingside, h5 becomes very dangerous. So nowadays, the critical line of the Austrian is considered c5, trying to eliminate white's big center. But now white plays bishop b5, and for example, bishop d7, and now e5, with the point of knight g4, e6. So the point of e6 here is to create a weakness there, and also for tactical reasons, it cuts off the protection knight on g4. So now, if black plays f takes e6, white's idea is to play knight g5, threatening knight takes e6, threatening knight on g4 with the very sharp position. So yeah, e6 is extremely common in the perk. In fact, if you play the Austrian, it's going to be mainline theory. So yeah, playing e5, e6, very very common attacking idea, but it's more of an opening idea than a middle game attacking idea.
Is it played in the Samish?
I don't think I've seen it there.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more unusual to play it in the Samish. The Samish board is more resemblance to like a Yugoslav attack. But okay, I have one more attacking theme to look at. So this was a very recent game. Kind of has to be considering if you know Wei Yi, he's
17 years old.
yeah, he's so young. Yeah, he's the youngest player over 2,700 right now. I think he's within the top 40 in the world now. He's very very sharp, very good player. Now as white here, he found a really nice way to attack, and this is a really common idea in Sicilians where black plays e5. So definitely keep this in mind. White played f6 here. Now it's not necessarily typical of white to give up a rook for knight on g8, but it is common for white to play bishop g5 and get rid of it that way. Now in this case, white played f6 because for tactical reasons, it works out very well. So let's check that out. F6, knight takes, and rook takes. So white's whole idea is to eliminate the defenders of the d5 square, and coincidentally d7. She takes f6, and now bishop b6. So the queen can't take the bishop because queen d7 is mate. So queen has to go to c6, and now knight a5, and white wins the bishop. Now black should have bailed out into an endgame here with queen takes h3, but white will have two pieces against the rook in this endgame, and it's not going to be fun for black. So black played rook b8, trying to avoid an endgame, but didn't work out here. Knight d5. So this has a really nice point. Rook takes b7, and now queen c3. So unfortunately for black, the threat of queen c8 is, yeah, queen c8 mate is pretty hard to defend against. And if you play something like d6, white just plays queen c6. And if queen d7, you lose the queen. And if rook d7, you get mated by queen c8. So queen c6, but now knight f6. And point being, if queen f6, then queen to c8, followed by bishop d8. So king e7. Now bishop d8. Can't take the bishop because of queen takes c6, and the pin on the d file won't let you take the queen back. So king e6. And now queen h3 with a really, really pretty mate there. But yeah, if you want to play better attacking chess, in terms of some young players right now, even just any players, Wei Yi is a great player. Just looking at his games, he is an amazing attacker. And of course, historically, Alyakin was fantastic. Kasparov, those are great attacking players. Fischer too, right? If you want to look at some classic attacking examples, like I mentioned, the Kotov game from Zurich in 1953, that's a classic. Another great one is the Fischer's game of the century against Byrne, where he sacrificed the queen for a couple pieces. That one's very pretty. Those are some games you can look at if you want some more examples.
But we have that book, The Art of Attacking Chess. I think many of you have your own copy, right? We purchased a copy for everybody a couple of years back. Yeah.
Yeah, that book is great. Definitely pay attention to the prose. I mean, the when he talks about the preconditions for a successful attack, those words are really invaluable. Just gets you to think about attacking a little bit differently. So it's definitely a great book. So all right, that's it for today.